Welcome to Echoes of Storyland. Before starting, please hit the like button and subscribe so we can continue making stories like this. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a soft glow over the small cemetery on the outskirts of the quiet town in Ohio. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the quiet sobs of family and friends gathered around the freshly dug grave. The priest, a middle-aged man with a somber expression, stood at the front, his voice reverberating with solemn reverence as he recited the traditional words for the departed. The deceased, a beloved member of the community, lay in the casket before him, draped in a simple yet elegant cloth. The mourners stood in respectful silence, their faces a mixture of grief and acceptance, yet a peculiar tension began to creep through the air. It was subtle at first, a whisper among the mourners as they shifted uneasily, glancing around to see if anyone else had noticed. The dog, an old and weathered golden retriever that had followed the deceased around for years, stood off to the side of the grave. At first, it seemed to be watching the proceedings with the quiet dignity of a loyal companion. However, as the priest's voice reached a crescendo, something in the air shifted. Without warning, the dog let out a sharp, guttural bark, its eyes wide and alert, as if it had seen something no one else could. The sound echoed through the cemetery, jarring the mourners from their somber trance. People flinched, some clutching their hands to their chests as the barking grew more intense, a continuous howl that seemed to reverberate through the very earth beneath them. The priest's eyes widened for a moment, his grip on the prayer book tightening. He stumbled slightly in his words, his voice faltering as he tried to regain his composure. The dog, oblivious to the looks of confusion and discomfort, continued to bark at the coffin, its tail stiff with tension. The mourners exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to react. Was this a sign, some kind of omen, or simply an old dog distressed by the funeral proceedings? The priest quickly raised a hand attempting to calm the dog, but the animal only responded with more fervor. As the ceremony continued, the unease grew. At the back of the group, a man who appeared to be a stranger to the family and the town, stood watching the scene unfold. He was tall, wearing a dark coat that seemed out of place for the occasion, his face inscrutable. He leaned toward the elderly woman next to him and asked, his voice soft but clear enough to carry, "Why does the priest look so nervous?" The question hung in the air like a spark in dry grass, igniting a wave of subtle tension among the attendees. The elderly woman, her eyes still trained on the barking dog, glanced at the priest, then back at the man. She didn't answer immediately, her lips pressing into a thin line as she considered the question. It was not the first time someone had asked about the priest's odd behavior during the ceremony, but the man's question felt more pointed, more urgent. She hesitated, then replied quietly, "The priest is more nervous than he lets on, but there's a reason for it." Her words were not comforting, and they only seemed to heighten the mystery surrounding the dog's unusual behavior. The man frowned slightly, his curiosity piqued, but before he could press for more information, the dog let out another series of frantic barks, louder this time. The priest, visibly uncomfortable, took a deep breath and began to speak once more, trying to push through the ceremony, but the unease was palpable. The entire group of mourners could feel it. Something was not right, and the question lingered in the air. Why did the priest seem so nervous? The man stood at the back of the group, the priest's nervous gestures and the dog's continued barking igniting a growing sense of unease within him. The ceremony, intended to offer solace, was now filled with an air of mystery, as if some unseen force had shifted the course of the event. Whispers began to spread, hushed voices that carried just enough to hint at something more than mere coincidence. "It's happening again," one elderly woman murmured, her voice tremulous. Another older man, standing nearby, nodded solemnly. "We thought it was over," he replied, his voice low but filled with a kind of resignation. The man who had asked about the priest's nervousness felt a chill run down his spine. The murmurs were unmistakable, and they didn't seem to be about the priest's flustered demeanor alone. They were about something deeper, something rooted in the past of this town. The dog barked again, more insistently this time, its body tense as it stood at the edge of the grave. The priest, his face pale and his hands shaking, continued his prayers, but his words were laced with a hesitation that hadn't been there before. The dog's barks seemed to intensify in response, almost as if it could sense the priest's discomfort. The man felt his curiosity grow, his desire to understand what was truly happening here outweighing any sense of propriety that might have told him to remain silent. He looked at the elderly woman who had spoken to him earlier and, stepping closer, asked quietly, "What's going on? Why does the priest look like that? Why is the dog acting like this?" The woman, her face drawn and weary, glanced around, ensuring no one was within earshot before leaning in. Her voice was barely a whisper, but her words were clear, laden with a weight of history. "This isn't the first time," she said softly, her eyes flicking nervously to the priest. "The dog's been barking at the coffin every time one of the townspeople dies. But it's not just that." The man frowned, confused. "What do you mean? What's the connection between the dog and the priest?" The woman hesitated before speaking again, her voice shaking as if recounting a deeply painful memory. "The priest and the man in that coffin, there's something they did years ago. Something the town's been trying to forget, something that's tied to why the dog barks." She paused, her eyes darting to the dog still barking, then back to the man. "The dog knows something, something that none of us ever wanted to acknowledge." The man felt a knot form in his stomach as the pieces began to fall into place, but the woman's cryptic words only deepened the mystery. "What do you mean the dog knows?" he asked, his voice urgent now. She sighed, looking down at the ground. "The priest was involved in something terrible, something that no one ever spoke of again. But the dog, it remembers." The man stared at her, unable to fully comprehend what she was implying. "What happened?" he pressed, his voice growing more insistent. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with sorrow and a kind of dread. "The town, it's hiding something. The dog has been trying to tell us the truth for years. And now it's barking at the coffin because that man, the one in the casket, was part of it." Her voice trailed off, leaving the man standing there, stunned and speechless. He glanced back at the priest, who had begun to tremble as the dog's bark seemed to grow louder, more insistent. It was as if the very earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to be revealed. The man was no longer merely curious. He was now desperate to understand what was happening, what the dog knew, and how it was all tied to the priest's past. As the ceremony continued, a heavy silence fell over the cemetery. The dog's barks were no longer just an inconvenience. They were a signal, a cry for the truth that had been buried for far too long. After the ceremony, as the mourners slowly filed out, the man lingered near the cemetery's gate, his mind reeling with the strange revelations from earlier. The elderly woman's words weighed heavily on him, the cryptic hints about the dog, the priest, and the man in the casket all swirling together in his thoughts. He couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just within reach, but no one seemed willing to speak it aloud. The dog's constant barking echoed in his mind, as if it were urging him to dig deeper, to uncover something that had been hidden for far too long. Unable to ignore the pull of curiosity, he approached the woman again, his voice low but urgent. "Do you have anything at all, that could explain what you're talking about? Some kind of record, something to show what happened?" The woman looked at him, hesitation flickering in her eyes. For a moment, it seemed as though she might refuse, but then she sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of years of silence. "There's a place in town," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "a library that holds more than books. But it's not something people talk about. Not anymore." Intrigued, the man nodded. "Take me there. I need to know what happened." She hesitated one last time before leading him to a small, unassuming building at the edge of town, its stone walls weathered and worn by the passage of time. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the musty scent of forgotten knowledge hanging in the dimly lit room. The woman led him to a back corner of the library, where old wooden shelves sagged under the weight of yellowed paper and brittle records. She knelt down before a long-forgotten chest, carefully unlocking it with a key she pulled from around her neck. Inside, there were stacks of old newspaper clippings, town records, and forgotten letters, all carefully preserved though clearly long untouched. The man watched as she sifted through the papers, her hands trembling slightly, as if she were reliving some painful memory. Finally, she pulled out a set of yellowing newspaper clippings, the headlines faded but still legible. "This is what you need to see," she said, handing them to him. The man took them, his eyes scanning the words quickly. What he found there shocked him to his core. The articles described a tragedy that had struck the town years ago, one that had shaken the entire community. A fire had broken out in the local church, a fire that had claimed the lives of several people, including a young family and the priest's closest friend, who, as it turned out, was the man now lying in the coffin. The reports described how the fire had been started in the church's basement, but there were conflicting accounts of how it had begun. Some said it was an accident, others whispered that it had been deliberate. And then there was the matter of the dog. The reports hinted that the dog, a young puppy at the time, had been locked inside the church with its owner, but it had somehow survived the blaze. The most chilling part of the story, however, was the secrecy surrounding the event. The priest, whose name appeared frequently in the articles, was described as having a strong connection to the deceased, but there was no mention of the exact nature of their bond. There were rumors, however, that the fire had been the result of a fight, something more than a mere disagreement. The dog, according to one of the surviving witnesses, had been seen acting strangely in the days following the fire, barking and howling as if it were mourning a loss. The man's heart began to race as he pieced the story together. The priest had lost someone close to him in that fire, the same man now lying in the coffin. And the dog had somehow known. The woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. "The dog made a promise that day," she said softly, as if she had read his mind. "A promise to never let anyone forget what happened. It's been barking ever since, trying to tell the truth, but no one's been willing to listen." The man looked at her, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just read. How could this town have kept such a dark secret buried for so long? Why had the priest remained so silent? And what had the dog witnessed that no one else could? The answer seemed just out of reach, but the connection was clear now. The dog knew something, and the priest was terrified that it would come to light. The man stood in the dusty library, the weight of the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. The pieces were coming together, but they only raised more questions. What happened on that fateful day so many years ago? What had the dog seen, and how could it hold the key to unraveling this decades-old mystery? The more the man spoke to the elderly residents of the town, the more the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but with each new piece came a deeper sense of unease. The town, once peaceful and unremarkable, seemed to be hiding an uncomfortable truth, a truth that had been buried beneath layers of silence and half-forgotten memories. The older residents were hesitant to speak at first, their words carefully chosen and guarded, but as the man pressed on, they began to reveal fragments of the past that had been long obscured. It was clear that the priest had not always been the man he appeared to be today. Many of the town's older inhabitants remembered him as a young, vibrant figure, full of hope and ambition, someone who had once inspired the community with his passion for his faith. But something had changed after the fire, something that had left a permanent mark on him. The priest, who had once been seen as a beacon of strength, now seemed fragile, haunted by the memories of the tragedy. The man began to hear whispers of a forbidden relationship between the priest and the deceased man, a bond that had remained hidden from the prying eyes of the town. Some said it was a deep friendship, others hinted at something more intimate, but no one dared to speak openly about it. The man's curiosity grew, and as he pieced the stories together, he learned that the fire had not been an accident, as the townspeople had always believed. Instead, it was the result of a heated argument between the priest and the deceased man, a disagreement that spiraled out of control and led to the tragic blaze that had claimed so many lives. The details of the fight were vague, but it was clear that the two men had been at odds over something far more personal than anyone had realized. The dog, the loyal companion who had been with the deceased man that fateful night, had been the only witness to the argument. It had been in the church when the fire started, and when it had ended, the dog had been the only survivor. The man, piecing these details together, realized that the dog's behavior now was not just a sign of distress, it was a living reminder of the guilt that haunted the priest. The dog had followed the priest since the fire, its barks never ceasing, as if it had taken on the burden of keeping the priest accountable for the tragedy. The man could now see that the dog's constant barking at the coffin was not a random act. It was a signal, a cry for justice for the man who had died. But the deeper the man dug, the more he realized that the truth was far more complicated than he had anticipated. There was a dangerous undercurrent to the entire situation. The priest's guilt was palpable, but it was also clear that he was hiding something darker, something that went beyond mere regret. The dog's role in all of this was a mystery unto itself. Why had it remained so loyal to the priest despite the suffering it had witnessed? And why had the dog, after all these years, chosen now to reveal its distress so publicly? The man felt torn. He had come to this town in search of answers, eager to unravel the mystery of the dog's strange behavior and the priest's apparent nervousness. But now, as the pieces of the past came together, he was faced with a more troubling realization. Some truths, no matter how deeply buried, were never meant to be unearthed. The truth about the fire, about the bond between the priest and the deceased man, was not something the town wanted to remember. The man felt a growing sense of dread, unsure if he should continue his investigation or leave well enough alone. Yet, as the dog continued its mournful howling at the grave, the man knew that he couldn't turn back. There were too many unanswered questions and too many people who needed to know the truth, no matter the consequences. The town, it seemed, was on the verge of confronting a history that had been locked away for far too long. The man's determination to uncover the truth had led him to this moment, standing face to face with the priest in a small, dimly lit room at the back of the church. The priest had agreed to meet him privately, but it was clear that he was struggling with the decision. His once strong and composed demeanor had been shattered, replaced by a haunted weariness that seemed to age him before the man's eyes. The man watched as the priest fidgeted nervously, unable to meet his gaze. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant, echoing bark of the dog outside. Finally, with a deep sigh, the priest spoke, his voice trembling as he began to unravel the terrifying truth of that night. "I've been carrying this with me for years," the priest confessed, his voice thick with shame. "I never wanted anyone to know, but I know it's time." The man leaned in, his heart racing, urging the priest to continue. The priest closed his eyes for a moment, as if bracing himself for the weight of the memory that was about to be revealed. "The man who died, the one in the coffin. He was my lover," the priest admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's breath caught in his throat. He had never imagined this truth, that the priest, the man who had spent his life dedicated to his faith, had shared such an intimate and forbidden bond with another. The priest seemed to shrink under the weight of his confession, his eyes filling with unshed tears. "We were in love, but it was a love that had to be hidden," he continued, his voice growing softer, as if the walls of the room were closing in around him. "This town, this church, none of them would have understood. We kept it a secret even from ourselves. But the guilt ate at me every day." The man sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he was hearing. The priest had lived a lie for years, and the town had never suspected the truth. The priest's voice grew heavier as he spoke of that night. "The argument we had, it was the worst of our lives," he said, his hands shaking. "He told me he was seeing someone else. He was in love with another man. It broke me, tore me apart. I never expected him to betray me like that." The priest paused, wiping his face with his sleeve. "I lost control. In my anger, his words faltered, and he closed his eyes in anguish. "I started the fire. It wasn't intentional, but it spread so quickly. I couldn't stop it. And by the time I realized what had happened, it was too late. The church burned down and so many people died." The man's heart sank as he pieced together the horrific details. The fire had not been an accident at all. It had been a moment of rage and betrayal, one that had cost the lives of so many, including the man the priest had once loved. The dog, the one that had been barking at the coffin, had been with the deceased man that night. It had witnessed the argument, had seen everything, the betrayal, the fire, and the pain that followed. "The dog never left me," the priest murmured, his voice full of sorrow. "It followed me everywhere after that. I tried to ignore it, to forget, but the dog knew what I had done. It wouldn't stop barking, wouldn't stop reminding me of the fire, of the people I had killed." The man's mind reeled. The dog's behavior had not been random, it had been a reflection of the priest's torment. The dog had been trying to hold the priest accountable for what he had done, for the lives lost that night. The priest's eyes met the man's, and there was a deep, unspoken understanding between them. "I've spent my life in penance," the priest whispered, his voice breaking. "But no matter how much I atone, the guilt never leaves. The dog knows, and it will never stop until everyone knows the truth." The man, his heart heavy with the priest's burden, finally understood the true depth of the tragedy that had unfolded all those years ago. The fire, the betrayal, and the untold pain that had followed, everything had led to this moment. The dog, now barking at the grave, was not just a reminder of the past, it was the last living witness, still calling for justice. The man realized that exposing this truth would destroy the priest, but it was the only way to allow the town to heal, to finally confront the horror that had been buried for so long. The man, now burdened with the truth, must decide whether to reveal the secret to the rest of the town or to protect the priest from the consequences of his actions. The dog's persistent barking continues to echo through the cemetery, a constant reminder of the unresolved guilt that has been passed down through the years. As the man wrestles with his decision, he begins to realize that revealing the truth would mean shattering the lives of everyone involved, including the priest and the grieving family. The town has lived under the shadow of this secret for so long that exposing it could tear apart the fragile fabric of the community. At the same time, the man understands that the dog's actions are not just about the priest's guilt but also about the need for closure, for both the priest and the town. Ultimately, the man decides to speak out, but not in the way anyone expects. He approaches the grieving family, sharing with them the truth about the relationship between the priest and the deceased man, but he does so in a way that respects their mourning. Instead of revealing the full extent of the betrayal and tragedy, the man chooses to focus on the love and bond that existed between the two men, offering a more compassionate interpretation of the past. The dog's barking finally stops as if it has found peace, and the town begins to heal, though the truth remains a painful but necessary part of their shared history. The man leaves Ohio, knowing that the town has finally begun to reconcile with its past, even if the full truth will never be fully known to all. As the man left the small town of Ohio, he could feel the weight of the journey he had undertaken. It was a bittersweet departure. He had uncovered the dark secrets that had haunted the priest and the town for years, but he had also seen the fragile beginnings of healing. The dog's barking, which had once been a constant reminder of the past, had stopped, and with it, so too had the endless tension that had plagued the community for so long. The town, though scarred, had started to reconcile with the painful history that had been buried for decades. The grieving family, though torn by the truth, had found a way to understand the bond that had existed between the priest and the deceased man, and in doing so, they had begun to accept the complexities of love and loss. The man knew that some stories would never be fully told, and some truths would always remain shrouded in mystery. But he also understood that the town had made its peace with what had been revealed. The priest, though still burdened by his guilt, had found a semblance of redemption in the quiet closure that the town now shared. The dog, too, had finally found rest. Its endless vigilance had come to an end, and the haunting echoes of the past were slowly fading away. As the man drove away from the cemetery, the sun began to set on the horizon, casting a golden glow over the quiet town. He didn't know what awaited him next, but he felt a sense of resolve. The town had been given a chance to move forward, to heal, and in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. The truth had been spoken, the past had been confronted, and now it was time for everyone to find their own peace. With that, the story concludes. Thank you for taking the journey with me. If you find this interesting, please subscribe for more stories and comment below your thoughts. Thanks.